That was very beautiful. Our scripture reading will be taken from Joshua 6, verse 23. And the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab, and her father and her mother and her brethren, and all that she had, and they brought out all of her kindred, and left them without the camp of Israel. Now we will hear from my father.
So it's kind of interesting that I'm speaking on the week my son is on the platform. So kind of interesting. Put on something so I could see up here. The story of Rahab is one that I thought would be fairly simple to go through and present. And of course, as you think about every story, the more you think about it, the less simple it becomes. And I found that true with the story of Rahab. So before we begin talking about her story, and of course, when you talk about Rahab, some of the topic is a little bit touchy for Christians to talk about, but there are things that we can learn and address in spite of the setting of her life. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear Lord, I ask that you'll be with us as we take a look at this rather interesting and unique person in the Bible. And may we learn some lessons that can apply to us, and we can come to maybe understand their life a little better. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, the story of Rahab I thought would be fairly straightforward, because you read in the Bible, she's only mentioned in one short passage in the Old Testament, and she's mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament as well, referring back to the passages in Joshua. However, as I went and looked into this, of course, many of you don't know, but all of the Old Testament stories have a great deal of commentary on them by Jewish tradition, and things that are recorded in their Talmuds, which add interesting information, which may or may not be true, but gives us some insight into what the Jewish people thought during the thousands of years of their reading of their books of the Bible and the commentaries and stuff that were passed down along with them. And as you do that, you come to realize that Rahab, that the scholars have a lot of different viewpoints on what type of person she was, depending on whether or not you're a Jew or a Christian. So let's go through the story, and then we'll talk a little bit about those. It says in Joshua chapter 2, Joshua's now been turned over as leader of the nation of Israel. Moses has died, and he now has to take over. And they're facing crossing the Jordan and going into the land of Canaan. And as they're facing this, Joshua does what any discreet and thoughtful general will do, that he decided to send 2 spies, saying, go view the land of Canaan, especially Jericho, which was right across the river, about 15 miles away from where they were crossing the Jordan River. And they went, and they came into a harlot's house named Rahab and lodged there. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The Jewish people will look at the word and the description of everything that describes Rahab and her house and the words involved, and they will say that Rahab was probably an innkeeper, not necessarily a harlot. Whereas in the New Testament, she's clearly referred to that way. And of course, the question is when you think about a Bible character, I'm always thinking, why did they do what they do? The Bible records what she did and how she did it. But when we look at this story, well, we'll look at some questions and we'll try and see if we can use that to understand who is this lady Rahab that they went and stayed, and why is she mentioned by name? Well, we can understand a little bit of why they may have gone there because Rahab had a house that was in the wall of the city, was right near the gate, and indeed, ladies of her business often were also the innkeepers, and they also were the ones that had food that you could purchase, and they ran hotels and things in addition to it. And so it was not unusual that if you're a spy and you want to go into a town, where can you go? Well, you'll not be noticed. You're going to go to a place where strangers come and go all the time. And that would be the inn, and of course the less reputable the inn, the better, because the less people are going to be interested in who comes and goes there. And so that's where the spies went. But it finally came to the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, these men have come tonight to look out the country, and they've come into our town." And so the king of Jericho, I guess these people had been watching these men when they came in. They saw where they went. And so the king went to Rahab and said, "Bring forth the men that came to you, which are gone into your house. For they came to search out all the country." They're spies, in other words. Now, of course, what could Rahab have done? As a woman of the world, she could have, well, here's some fast money. She could have said, "I'll bring them out, give me 20 pieces of silver," or something like that, and sold them to the king and made some money. She could have just turned them over to the king. After all, they were Israelites. They weren't even people from her town. Instead, she had taken an entirely different course of action with them. It says that the woman, Rahab, had taken the two men and hid them, and said thus, and so she told the king, "They came here, but I didn't know who they were. And when it got about time to shut the gates, and it was dark, the men went out. And where they went, I don't know. So if you chase after them quickly, you might overtake them." So this raises another philosophical dilemma. Is Rahab okay to lie to cover up for these spies who are God's spies coming into the land? I tell you, it's an interesting story, and there are layers to this that you have to think about. Because it says that she had brought them up into the roof of her house and hid them with the stalks of flax which she had laid upon the roof. And so the king's men pursued after them all the way to the Jordan and unto all the fords. And as soon as they had pursued after them, they shut the town gates. Because after all, they didn't want them coming out or in, and so they were going to watch the gates and make sure that they couldn't get out or in. And then we see something interesting that Rahab does. As we look at this, I hope that this will give us some insights into why she may have been the kind of person she was and why she was making these kind of decisions. So she takes the men and says, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen on all of us." So the first thing Rahab tells them quietly now, she's got to deal with the situation, is, "I know that the Lord has given you this land." Rahab shows that she's a perceptive person, that she's following the political comings and goings of her day, that she's aware of what people think in her town, and she says that all the people are afraid of you, and we've heard of the stories of how the Lord brought you through the Red Sea and how you defeated the two kings, Sihon and Og. Og was a giant, like Goliath. And when we heard these things, our hearts melt. And there was no more courage in us because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and earth beneath. My, a woman of this kind coming to this conclusion, when many of the Israelites hardly believed that God was the God of heaven. She was willing to recognize this, and as I said, she's a woman that shows great perception into the comings and goings on and the significance of them of her day. Not just a simple woman who runs a house by the gates of the town. And so she decides to take action on this knowledge and this conclusion that she's come to. So she makes a deal with the two spies, saying that when you come to this town and you defeat it, I want you to spare me and all my family, my father, my brothers and sisters, and my mother, and all of them. Will you do this? And of course they agreed. Since you have delivered us from the king, spared our lives, that we will provide safety for your family when we take Jericho. Again, this shows some understanding. This woman is is a woman of thought and planning, takes control of the situation, realizes that she's got these spies in her house, that these spies are probably going to defeat their land, and she has to make a decision, and she makes a decision to throw her lot with the Israelites rather than take her chances with the people of Jericho. And after she gets them to agree on the pain of death, that they will deliver her, she lets them down by a rope, it says by a cord, out of the window, and they go our way. Of course, in the deal, she had to have some signal that would tell them which house was hers. And so they gave her a red piece of linen twine, a string in one verse of the Bible, translation of the Bible, to hang in her curtains so that they would know which house was theirs. And then the spies went away, and they reported all of this to Joshua, and of course he then agreed that this is what they would do. So now let's take a look at Rahab and what kind of person she is and why she may have taken some of these things. One of the things that we know is that in the Old Testament, being a harlot was the result of a lot of different possible choices. One is that she could have been involved in the religious priestesses of her day. However, the word that's used for her in this chapter of the Bible does not indicate that she is one of those. She could have ended up with this course of life because her family had cast her out and thrown her out. And this would not be unusual because young women who got caught up in bad situations and then got left by their husbands or the men in their lives, they had no welfare service, they had nothing like we have today. They were oftentimes cast out by society and left to figure out how to survive on their own. And yet when you look at her story, it doesn't look like she's been abandoned by her family, does it? Because the first thing that you notice, that when she sees a chance to save herself, she uses this opportunity to not only save herself, but her family and her brothers and sisters. That she still is highly attached to her family and very much a part of them. And so that leaves some other choices, and that is what happened in the village about her. And when we look at that, we see that Rahab seems rather quick, I don't know if quick is the right word, but seems willing to turn her back on all the people of the town and the king and to set them aside to try and help spies from a foreign land so that she and her family can be saved. So when you look at these sorts of things, you try and understand why would she have made some of these choices. We can only suppose, but it does seem like Rahab probably had some issues with the people in the town and with the king and with the society there, and that's what had kind of put her in her situation. It wasn't a family thing, it was a society thing. So I decided, well, the Bible doesn't have all the information that's available. Why don't I go to the Talmud and see what that has to say about Rahab? How many of you know about the Talmuds? A few of you. Some of you who heard me preach have probably heard about the Talmuds, because I talk about them from time to time. Well, the Jews have lots of other interesting writings that supplement the Bible, and I say supplement, they don't replace, and you can't always use the Talmud as truth. But it does give some idea of the Jewish view of the people of the Old Testament and their story. And when you go to the Talmud, you find out that Rahab actually has an interesting story there. According to the Talmud, Rahab told the two spies, and it gives the name of the two spies. One of them is Caleb, and I don't remember what the other one's name was. Something like Pichu or something like that. Some unusual name. That Rahab was 10 years old when the Israelites left Egypt. And being a girl of 10 years old, the story of the Israelites and their escape over the Red Sea had a big impact on her. And so as she became older and ended up running this inn and the business and everything that she was in, for the 40 years that they were in the wilderness, so that would put Rachel, what, about 50 now? When they're coming into her town. She's a lady who's had some experience, but has been watching the Israelites during all of this time. The Talmud also says that Rahab, and I don't know that this part is true, but Rahab was considered the most beautiful woman in the world, and that no man could utter her name 2 times without being overcome by her beauty. I don't know if that's true or not. But it does give us an understanding that Rahab had a very powerful reputation and was well known, and that she was a consort of the very wealthy and the very rich and the very powerful. Not just in Jericho, but around the whole area. And there are some other stories that, because of the nature of her business, I can't repeat here that are in the Talmud, but that's okay. They're not necessary for our sermon. But in any case, we get the idea when you read Talmud that it does support what I kind of figured out when I read the Bible, that this lady was a lady of substance and significance, and that her issues came from society and her position in it, more so than what we normally might think of, and that she was a person of influence. Otherwise, why would the king believe a lie from her so quickly if he thought that she were a devious, conniving, cheap, run-of-the-mill type of person in town? Everything she said would have been checked out. They would have searched the house a whole lot more carefully than they did. But because of the reputation she has, when she says something and when she takes control of the situation, she's doing so because that's the type of person that she's developed into being. And so when you look at a person like Rahab, we're looking at someone who's not just something that sometimes is portrayed in the movies, but possibly a significant woman, and that's why the story is included in the Old Testament. Because to have her choose to leave her village and to convert and become a follower of the Lord and a member of the tribes of Israel is significant. It's like a king or a ruler leaving and doing that. It would be like Cleopatra of Egypt leaving and becoming part of the Jewish nation. That the name Rahab carried weight throughout all of that land as the Jews were coming in. It gives the story a whole different understanding, doesn't it? And it makes us understand why she was willing to make the choices that she did. Why she was willing to set aside any allegiance she had to the people of Jericho, whom there may have been difficulties with, and instead, as a result of her observance of God's work with the nation of Israel throughout the course of her life, she came to the conclusion that many others should have come to, that the ruler and the leader of the Israelites was truly the God of heaven and the God of the earth beneath. And when faced with a life choice about what to do with that information, and brought to the crossroads finally of her life, she chose to follow and choose the way of the Lord instead of her past. That is significant. How many other people have we seen who have influence, might have position, might have a reputation, might even be caught up in lives that are trapped with the choices that they've made in their life, and they don't know what to do, and they come to a point where they're faced with the reality of God, choose not to follow him. So let's take a look at how the story concludes, now that we've pulled away some of the layers of Rahab and found out that she's actually a very interesting person. Well, finally, they decide that they are going to go attack Jericho, and so they attack Jericho, as you know, in the most strange way, that they come, and for 6 days they march around the city in quiet. Perhaps the priests are blowing their trumpets as they march around. They tramp around the city for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, they start coming around, and I can imagine that the first day the army shows up, Rahab's going around to all of her family and saying, "You've got to come to my house." I don't know what she can tell them. Can she tell them, "I just made a deal with the spies"? I made a deal with the spies, and so we're going to be saved if you come to my house. I don't know that she could have said that, because her family might have turned her in. But anyway, she's able to convince her family, and the first day they all come to her house. They look out the window. She's making sure this little red string is very prominent and clear so that they'll see it, and they watch them march around the city. And as they march around the city, nothing happens, and they all leave. That wasn't all that false alarm, and so they all kind of go back to their house again. And the next day, the same thing happens. Now we're talking about a different kind of faith. That now the second day comes, and the army marches around the city of Jericho. All of Rahab's family now has to come back to her house again, because they don't know what's going to happen. And they all sit there and they watch them go around the thing, and then what happens? Nothing. All right? So then they come the third day, and the army of Israel comes and starts marching around Jericho. And now Rahab's family all has to come and gather in her house. Now I want to ask you a question. We've all been faced with false alarms, right? I remember when I was a boys' dean. It's hard to forget being a boys' dean. But one of the things that we had in our dorm was we had alarms that about this time of year, when it went from being hot and humid to being cold in the evenings, you know how water condenses on stuff? Well, the water would condense on all the fire alarms in our halls, and the fire alarms would go off. Sometimes, 11:30 at night, sometimes 1 o'clock in the morning, And it got to be the point where once the fire alarms went off, the guys would all get up and then they'll stick their head out the window and they all go back to bed. All right? About the third time it goes off each year, all the old guys are telling the new guys, don't even bother getting out of bed, just roll over. Okay? Because it's a false alarm. I mean, it didn't take 3 times of a false alarm. They all ignored the fire alarms after that. So, of course, the rest of the story is, one day we had a fire in the dorm at 1 o'clock in the morning. Some guests had come, and I think they were literature evangelists. They'd come, and they'd had a special rally, so about a dozen of them were staying in the dorm, and they had had a prayer service down in the school chapel that went till about 11:30, and then this guy came back to his room, and he wanted to pray, so he didn't want to turn his light on, because it's a dormitory, and so he thought it would be smart to set a candle on the windowsill, and then he would pray by his candle. And so he was praying by his candle and fell asleep. And the candle, of course, burned over, fell over, the burning wax ran over, caught the curtains, and he woke up to this mass of flames in front of his face and went running out of the room, yelling, fire, fire, and the alarms went off, and the guys just rolled over and went back to sleep. So I had to go down the door and knock on every room where a guy was, tell them there really was a fire, and I had one guy who wouldn't get out of his bed, so I had to take his mattress and his blankets and him and everything, and I gave one big yank, and his mattress and blankets went flying onto the floor. He got up. So, but I'm just saying, you know, we get used to false alarms, and false alarms wear away quite quickly at our faith and our commitment. Yes? Okay. So, when we see that, I can imagine that now the faith of Rahab and her family are being tested by these false alarms. You know, I often now think that maybe God had them march around 7 days wasn't just to test the faith of the Israelites, maybe it was to test the faith of Rahab and her family. Did they really believe that God was going to defeat the city? Did they really believe, in spite of 6 false alarms, would they still keep coming to the house? Would they still be ready? Would they still be prepared so that when the city fell, that they would be in a place of safety? Would they really? I want to ask you, how many times have you, well, of course, if you watch the news all the time, you know, how many times have we heard that we're going to fight the war with Syria in the last month? I mean, it seems like every 2 or 3 days we're getting ready to fight Syria, and then the next day we're not going to fight them, and then 2 days later we are going to go fight. You know, depends. And so you get all these false alarms, and people get all wound up, and what does everybody start to do eventually? Oh, nothing's going to happen there, right? And they all kind of don't pay attention. Well, what if they do go to war, and then you aren't ready? Have you ever heard Jesus is coming? Right? Well, Jesus might come this time, or you hear some event, and then you think, well, maybe Jesus will come, and, you know, it looks like events are going on, and you think, well, we could have Jesus come. So then you decide that Jesus didn't come, so maybe it doesn't make any difference, and pretty soon you start thinking that Jesus isn't going to come anymore, right? And all of these false alarms get you to become complacent. Well, the 7th day finally comes, and the army marches around the city of Jericho, and they march around once, and then twice, and then 5 times, and 6 times. I think about now the family's thinking it's serious. I would say that on this day, as they continue to march around the city, anyone who was in her family had any idea that being in her house would be a place of safety, had finally decided that this was it, and they were actually there. And so they come and they blow the trumpets, and when they blow the trumpets, the walls all fall down, except for one part of the wall, because somebody's house is built into the wall, and her roof is part of the wall, and it has a red string in the curtains of the window. And so the soldiers are all told at this point, when the walls fall, you go straight in. Wherever you are, you go straight in the city, you kill everything except Rahab and her family, because they protected the spies. And her faith really is going to be the one that will save them. And so when they went in, they did kill all of the people, all of the cattle and everything, except for the one family, the family of Rahab. And so Rahab now and her family come out, and of course in the verse we read, it says, and the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all that were with them, and brought all of her kind and left them outside the camp of Israel. Of course, they couldn't come into the camp of Israel because they were not Israelites. And they couldn't bring them in at this time until probably they went through some sort of ceremonies or decisions or whatever they were going to do with her and her family. And it says that Joshua saved Rahab, the harlot, alive, and her father's household, and all that she has, and she dwells in Israel even unto this day. And if you go into 2 Chronicles, it talks about that there was an important family in Israel who were known for their skill in the keeping and making of flax clothing and cloth. And it's believed that this is still the family of Rahab, who were the ones who were the flax manufacturers and clothing. After all, she hid the spies in flax on her roof. And so the descendants of Rahab and her family continue throughout the history of Israel. Now, according to the Talmud, eventually she gets married to somebody named Joshua ben Lin, and eventually becomes the descendants of her are some of the great prophets of Israel. Jeremiah and Huldah and some of these people become the great prophets of Israel. If you talk to some of the Christians who look at the New Testament, there is a Rahab mentioned in the lineage of Jesus in the book of Matthew. It says Salmon had his son by Rahab. There's some question whether it's the same Rahab or not, since there are two men involved. One is in the Bible and one is in the Talmud. They could be the same Rahab or they could be different ones. But Christians will tend to see Rahab as being one of those who was an ancestor in the line of Jesus because of her inclusion in the book of Matthew. When we look then at the story of Rahab, it tells us several lessons. Several lessons that we can quickly draw from this story. Number one, there are people of influence in the world around us who are watching God's handiwork and how he works in the lives of Christians around them, and we are having an influence of them and we don't realize it. This is what happened with Rahab. For 40 years she had watched the nation of Israel. And we don't know when they will come to a time of influence, when they will contact someone who is a Christian, and it is our influence and our reputation and the things that we have done in the name of the Lord that will be the way in which they can find their way out of whatever life they're in and change and become different. In fact, when you look up Rahab on the internet, you'll find that there are at least a half a dozen Rahab type of societies that have that name in it. These are societies that are designed to find young women who've been caught up in the sex industry. And as Christians, they're trying to help them escape that kind of life and find a new life. And these people will be able to do so because of the influence and story of Rahab and her inspiration for people to do this kind of work. Because those people are hard to reach and hard to help escape. So that's the first lesson I think that we can learn from the story of Rahab. The second thing that we can recognize from the story of Rahab is a person who's committed to their own salvation also wants and desires the salvation of their family and their friends. Right? Because that's the first thing Rahab does. She finds a way of escape finally. She's going to be able to be saved from the life that she's had, from living in Jericho, and she's going to be able to follow the Lord and become part of the Israelite nation. And so she makes this way of escape available not only to her, but to her family and to her friends. She becomes an evangelist. How many of you have directly influenced 30 people to become don't raise your hands, to become baptized members of the church? Well, I'll bet Rahab did that in 1 week. She became an evangelist for what she knew. And as is often the case, whenever God has a destruction coming, he always provides a way of escape. I wonder what would have happened if the whole city of Jericho had found out about her deal and wanted in on it. Right? And so the whole town packs into her house somehow. That could have happened, right? Would God have spared the whole town of Jericho if they were willing to express a very clear willingness and desire to follow him? How about you, young people? Are you being offered a way of escape and a position to find your way to the Lord, that he's offering you a way that you can find and commit your life to him? Are you going to follow it? Are you going to be there? Or are you going to say, I can wait? I can wait. I don't think it's that important. No, that's not what I want to do. I'm happy being the way I am. Jericho's a fine city. The Israelites won't defeat it. It's easy for us to do that. And then when an opportunity comes for us to find our way to the Lord, we don't find it because we're too busy. Too busy being a member of Jericho. Finally, I think one of the things that can also be an encouragement is that when you look at Rahab, it doesn't matter what your past has been or what choices you've made. You can be at the bottom of society. You can live a life that's terribly immoral. And you are never too far away that God cannot reach out and touch and show you who he is. Right? It just can't happen. And God was willing to meet her where she was. He even overlooked the fact she did all this lying for the spies, right? Because that's kind of where Rahab was at that time. So God took her where she was and gave her an opportunity to escape, brought her into the land of Israel, where she eventually was able to become married and a part of the Israelite nation, and her ancestors became her descendants became part of the nation of Israel for hundreds of years, even all the way into the time of the kings, hundreds of years later. And she's also mentioned, I believe, in the Hall of Fame of people of faith in the book of Hebrews. With that in mind, I want to give two challenges. The first challenge is to follow the example of Rahab's family, and when you see an opportunity for God to provide a way of escape, that you'll take advantage of it, even if it seems to fall through several times. Stay with it. Eventually it will happen. The second thing I want you to think about is you may be very successful. Rahab was very successful in the world. But the values of the world are not the same values as God's values. And someday you'll wake up and discover that you've been living a life that has no eternal value. And it doesn't matter at that point where you've been or what you've done. When you realize that you've not been living a life that has eternal value, you can call upon God, and God will reach out, and he will reach into your life and provide you a way of salvation. And these are things that can be an encouragement to each and every one of us. There are many other lessons I hope you got from this story as I went through it. I hope I've given you an idea to think about Rahab in a lot more significant way than you may have in the past. Every story in the Bible is there to teach us lessons. All things were written for our instruction. Okay? We'll have a closing hymn at this time. Dear Lord, as we looked at a story from the Old Testament, we try and understand who a person was and why they made the choices they did. It does give us courage that you are constantly searching throughout the world for those who are willing to recognize you as their God. And when you find them, no matter who they are, you'll bring them into your fold. We thank you for this. In your name I pray. Amen.